January 1945, somewhere in the American Southwest, the morning air is cold enough to sting the lungs. A thin frost clings to the wooden barracks as German prisoners of war file forward in silence. Boots crunch on gravel. Breath hangs in pale clouds. The war feels far away here, yet it presses on every thought. Inside the mess hall, the warmth is immediate. Steam rises from metal trays. The smell is unfamiliar coffee, real coffee. Fresh bread, meat, not thin slices. Whole portions. Eggs, pale yellow, still glossy with fat. Potatoes piled high, not stretched thin, not mixed with fillers. The prisoners stop. For a moment, no one speaks. Then a sound breaks the stillness. Laughter, sudden, sharp, uncontrolled. A few men shake their heads, convinced it must be a mistake. Others laugh harder, clutching their sides, tears forming in the corners of their eyes. It is not joy. It is disbelief. Some stare at the food without touching it, as if it might vanish. Others look away, suddenly uncomfortable. They have marched across Europe on half rations. They have eaten bread mixed with sawdust. They have watched civilians starve. And now, in captivity, the enemy is feeding them better than their own country ever could. That realization does not end with laughter. It settles quietly, heavily, and it will follow them long after the trays are cleared back through memory, back toward a war already decided elsewhere. By the time those prisoners entered the American mess hall, Germany had already been fighting a losing battle for years, one that had little to do with tactics or courage, and everything to do with food. Long before Allied bombs reduced cities to rubble, the German state had begun rationing its future. When war broke out in September 1939, the Reich moved immediately to control calories. Bread, meat, fats, sugar, everything was measured, stamped, and restricted. On paper, it was efficient. In reality, it was fragile. Germany had never been self-sufficient in food. Even in peacetime, it depended on imports of grain, fats, and animal feed. The British naval blockade during the First World War had nearly starved the country into submission, and Nazi planners remembered that lesson well. Autarky became doctrine. Synthetic fuels, ersatz materials, substitutes for everything, including food. By 1940, ration cards governed daily life. Civilians received just enough to function, not enough to thrive. Meat became occasional, butter became precious. Coffee was replaced by roasted barley. Bread was stretched with potato flour and cellulose. Officially, these were temporary sacrifices for victory. Unofficially, hunger crept in quietly, year by year. The Wehrmacht was prioritized, but even the army felt the strain. Early campaigns, Poland, France, the Low Countries were short and victorious. Supply lines held, soldiers ate reasonably well. But the war did not end in 1940, it expanded. And Germany's food system was not built for a global conflict of attrition. The invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941 shattered any remaining illusions. Operation Barbarossa consumed men, fuel, animals, and calories on an unprecedented scale. German planners assumed the campaign would feed itself, that conquered land would provide grain and livestock. Instead, scorched earth, logistical chaos, and partisan warfare ensured shortages followed the army eastward. By the winter of 1941, German soldiers at the front were already underfed. Rations were reduced. Fresh food disappeared. Supply trains failed to arrive. Hunger weakened bodies already strained by cold and exhaustion. Letters home spoke less of victory and more of empty stomachs. At home, the situation worsened in parallel. Allied bombing disrupted transportation and agriculture. Farm laborers were conscripted or killed. Foreign forced laborers replaced them, often underfed themselves. Calorie counts fell steadily. By 1942, civilian rations were well below nutritional needs, especially for urban populations. The regime compensated with propaganda. Posters promised abundance after victory. Newspapers downplayed shortages. Complaints were framed as defeatism, but no speech could change the scale. Germany was fighting industrial giants with an economy already stretched to its limits. As the war dragged into 1943, defeat at Stalingrad marked more than a military turning point. It was a psychological rupture. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers were lost, captured, or killed. Entire units vanished. With them went years of training and enormous quantities of food and supplies that could never be replaced. From that moment on, German soldiers knew hunger as a constant companion. On the Eastern Front, rations collapsed entirely. In Italy, in France, even in Germany itself, food became a daily calculation. What could be spared? What could be stolen? What could be endured? And it was from this world of shrinking portions and growing doubt that many of the men who would later laugh in American captivity were taken prisoner, unaware that their journey was about to carry them into a completely different reality of war. While Germany was learning to ration scarcity, the United States was mobilizing abundance. When America entered the war in December 1941, it did so with a continental economy untouched by bombing and a food system unlike any the world had ever seen. The United States was not simply self-sufficient, it was overproductive. Vast farmlands stretched from the Midwest to California. Mechanized agriculture multiplied output. Rail networks connected farms to factories, ports, and bases with clockwork reliability. Food was not an afterthought of American war planning. It was a weapon. The U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps treated nutrition as logistics science. Calories were counted. Protein ratios were calculated. Morale was measured not just in victories but in meals. Soldiers were to be fed consistently, predictably, and well enough to fight for months at a time. Hunger, American planners believed, destroyed discipline faster than enemy fire. By 1942, standardized rations became a defining feature of the U.S. military. The SHA ration provided canned meat, bread, coffee, sugar, and sweets. The K ration, designed for short combat operations, included chocolate, biscuits, chewing gum, and powdered beverages. These were not luxuries. They were tools of endurance. Just as important was what civilians experienced at home. Unlike Europe, the United States never faced famine. Rationing existed, but it was designed to ensure fairness, not survival. Meatless days and sugar limits were inconvenient, not life-threatening. Supermarket shelves remained stocked. Farms expanded production rather than contracting under fire. This surplus extended outward, across oceans. The Lend-Lease program fed not only Allied armies but entire populations. Britain, the Soviet Union, China all received American food shipments in staggering quantities. Wheat, canned meat, powdered milk. Calories became diplomacy. And then there were the prisoners. By 1943, tens of thousands of German soldiers were captured in North Africa. More followed in Italy, France, and after D-Day. Transporting them to Britain or keeping them in overcrowded European camps strained Allied resources. The solution was logistical and strategic. Ship them across the Atlantic. By war's end, more than 370,000 German posts would be held in the United States. Camps appeared in Texas, Arizona, Oklahoma, Louisiana, Mississippi, Nebraska, Colorado. Many were located near farmland where prisoners could work under guard, helping offset labor shortages. International law governed their treatment. The 1929 Geneva Convention required captors to feed prisoners rations comparable to those of their own troops. The United States complied sometimes to the letter, sometimes beyond it. Posts received the same base rations as American soldiers stationed domestically. They were inspected regularly by the International Red Cross. For German prisoners, this was incomprehensible. They arrived thin, exhausted, conditioned by years of scarcity. Some had marched for weeks on reduced rations. Others had survived encirclement, retreat, or starvation in the field. None expected generosity from the enemy. Instead, they encountered structure, order, clean barracks, medical care, and food served regularly in quantities that seemed obscene compared to what they had known. This was not charity. It was confidence. The United States could afford to feed its enemies well because the laughter did not come all at once. At first, it was silence, men standing still, trays in hand, eyes fixed on portions they did not yet trust. Years of conditioning told them food was counted, hoarded, guarded. That abundance always hit a trick. Then someone laughed, not loudly. A short, sharp exhale of disbelief, another followed. Soon the sound spread across the mess hall, uneven and uncontrolled. For many prisoners, the reaction was physical before it was emotional. Hands shook. Some ate too quickly, stopping only when stomachs rebelled. Others could not eat at all. They stared at the food, suddenly aware of how thin they had become, how normal hunger had felt back home. This was not humor in the traditional sense. It was release. Shock breaking through discipline. Laughter was the only language left when words failed. In later interviews, former posts struggled to describe that moment. Some spoke of shame, others of anger. A few admitted envy not of American soldiers, but of American civilians who lived in a country where this was normal. Food stripped away illusion. Propaganda had taught them the enemy was decadent, soft, weakened by excess. But excess, they now saw, did not equal fragility, it equaled capacity. For years, German soldiers had been told endurance was strength. To go without was proof of commitment. Hunger was reframed as virtue. The harder life became, the more necessary victory appeared. The POW camp shattered that logic. The mind could justify defeat in battle. Weather, terrain, bad orders, but food was different. Food was fundamental. It spoke to the deepest reality of war. Who could sustain effort longer? Seeing American abundance forced a recalculation. If the enemy could feed prisoners like this, what were they feeding their own soldiers at the front? What were they feeding their civilians at home? Laughter turned inward. It became corrosive. Some prisoners withdrew. Others became quiet, irritable. Faith in leadership weakened, not suddenly but steadily. This was not indoctrination. It was observation. The war, they realized, was not being lost at the front alone. It was being lost in fields, factories, rail yards, and kitchens. In Germany, food had become symbolic long before scarcity made it precious. Meals were tied to tradition, region, memory. Bread was not just bread. It was continuity. In the camps, prisoners encountered unfamiliar foods prepared plainly, without ceremony. Yet the sheer volume overwhelmed cultural distance. You did not need to understand American cooking to understand a full stomach. Some prisoners traded stories at the tables, comparing rations from home, laughing again more quietly now. Not at the food, but at the realization of how far the world they knew had already collapsed behind them. What unsettled them most was not that Americans ate well. It was that they did so without spectacle, no celebration, no ideology, just routine. And that routine, repeated day after day, carried a message more powerful than any broadcast from Berlin. The implications of that message extended beyond emotion and culture. They pointed toward something structural, something that reached into the mechanics of how wars are actually won. For the German prisoners, the food on their trays was evidence of a system they could not see but immediately understood. Every meal represented miles of rail track, acres of farmland, refineries, factories, warehouses, and schedules that worked. Not occasionally, not heroically, but reliably. This was not improvisation. It was infrastructure. German soldiers had lived the opposite reality. Supply lines that broke under pressure. Trains delayed by bombing. Units surviving on whatever could be scavenged. Logistics had been treated as something to endure rather than something to dominate. In the American camps, logistics were invisible precisely because they functioned. Food arrived on time. Portions were consistent. Waste existed. And waste, in wartime, was the clearest signal of surplus. For many prisoners, this was the first moment they grasped the true scale of the war they were fighting. Not a contest of armies, but of systems. Germany had wagered everything on speed and will. The United States had wagered on production and sustainability. One of those bets could last longer. American policy toward prisoners was not accidental. It was deliberate, calculated, and deeply pragmatic. The U.S. Army understood that mistreated prisoners created resistance, escape attempts, and international condemnation. Well-fed prisoners worked. They complied. They caused fewer problems. They also became living proof to inspectors, to allies, and eventually to the prisoners themselves of American confidence. Officers were instructed to follow the Geneva Convention strictly. Red Cross inspections were welcomed, not feared. Reports consistently noted adequate food, clean facilities, and medical care. For German posts, this consistency eroded the image of American chaos painted by Nazi propaganda. There was no cruelty to rally against. No narrative of victimhood that could sustain loyalty to a collapsing regime. The war did not end for them with defeat in battle. It ended gradually at the mess table. Perhaps the most unsettling angle was the simplest. The enemy no longer looked weak. American soldiers guarding the camps were often young, relaxed, well-fed themselves. They complained about boredom, not hunger. They spoke casually of home, of farms and cities untouched by war. For prisoners who had marched through ruins and ration lines, this was destabilizing. The contrast was total. The enemy, it turned out, had not been bluffing. The factories, the farms, the ships, all real. This recognition did not make the prisoners admire America. But it made denial impossible, and once denial collapsed, something else followed, an understanding that the war's outcome was no longer a question of bravery or sacrifice, but of arithmetic. Men began to count calories, trains, acres, time, and with that calculation came the turning point, not marked by explosions or surrender documents, but by a quiet, irreversible shift in belief that Germany could not outlast what it had awakened. The moment did not arrive with an announcement. There was no single meal, no specific camp, no exact day when realization struck all at once. Instead, it emerged gradually, accumulating over weeks and months, until disbelief gave way to something heavier. By late 1944, German POW camps across the United States followed a predictable rhythm. Roll call at dawn. Work details for those assigned to farms, lumber yards, or road crews, lunch, more work, dinner, lights out. The routine was monotonous, almost peaceful compared to the chaos many prisoners had come from, and the food never stopped. As winter gave way to early spring in 1945, the camps grew quieter, not because the prisoners had accepted defeat easily, but because the arguments were over. There was no longer anything to debate. The evidence arrived 3 times a day, carried on trays and ladled into bowls. For years, belief in victory had survived on distance. Distance from the front, distance from reality. In the United States, that distance collapsed. The war was no longer something imagined through speeches or newspapers. It was measured in supply chains and calories. Some prisoners tried to rationalize it. America, they argued, was temporary. It had entered late. It lacked endurance. But even these defenses weakened under repetition. Weeks became months. The food did not change. Others experienced something closer to grief. They spoke less, wrote fewer letters. A few stopped listening to news altogether. They already knew what was coming. By April, rumors reached the camps faster than official announcements. Berlin encircled. Hitler gone. Units surrendering en masse. American guards confirmed little, but they did not deny much either. On May 7, 1945, the war in Europe ended. There was no celebration in most camps, no cheering, just stillness. Men sat on bunks or walked slowly along the wire. Some cried. Others stared at the ground. A few laughed again, briefly, softly, at the absurdity of it all. In the days that followed, the meaning of those meals crystallized fully. The prisoners understood now that their captivity had not been an exception to the war, but a summary of it. Germany had fought brilliantly at times, courageously, ruthlessly, but it had fought with shortages, with improvisation, with promises that could not be kept. The United States had fought with abundance, not only of weapons, but of time, fuel, and food. It had fed soldiers, allies, civilians, and even enemies without breaking stride. For the prisoners, this realization was final. It stripped away the last residue of myth, not with bombs or slogans, but with bread. Bread that arrived every day, and once that truth was understood, the war ended not just officially, but internally. The end of the war did not end captivity. For hundreds of thousands of German prisoners in the United States, May 1945 marked the beginning of waiting. The camps remained operational. Guards stayed at their posts. Meals were served as before. The routines continued, even as the reason for them had vanished. Repatriation would take time. Europe lay in ruins. Transport ships were scarce. American authorities prioritized stability over speed, determined to avoid chaos in a continent already shattered. Inside the camps, behavior shifted. Discipline improved. Escape attempts, already rare, nearly disappeared. The war was over. There was nowhere left to run. Many prisoners were assigned to labor programs. They worked on farms, harvested crops, repaired roads. For some, it was the first time in years they felt useful rather than expendable. They were paid small wages as required by international law and could purchase items at camp canteens: soap, paper, extra food. The contrast deepened. Letters from Germany painted a grim picture. Cities reduced to rubble. Food shortages severe. Entire families surviving on rations far below subsistence levels. Prisoners began sending part of their earnings home through approved channels. Some shared food from Red Cross parcels with fellow inmates who had received worse news. American camp commanders noted the change. Reports described German posts as cooperative, orderly, and largely resigned. The bitterness many had expected did not materialize. Instead, there was reflection. Red Cross inspections continued after the war's end. Their findings remained consistent: adequate food, shelter, and medical care. In several reports, inspectors remarked on the irony that prisoners were physically healthier than much of the civilian population in defeated Germany. For the men themselves, this was difficult to reconcile. Gratitude mixed with guilt. Survival felt undeserved when so many at home were hungry. Food remained central to this reckoning. Meals were no longer shocking, but they never became invisible. Each one reinforced a memory that would linger long after the camps were dismantled. And as weeks turned into months, another question emerged, one that looked beyond immediate survival and toward the meaning of what they had experienced. That question would not be answered in the camps themselves, but in the long shadow that captivity cast over the post-war world. When repatriation finally began, many prisoners left the camps with mixed emotions. They returned to a country they barely recognized. Germany in late 1945 was not simply defeated, it was hollowed out. Railways twisted and broken. Fields neglected or cratered. Cities reduced to skeletal outlines of stone and ash. Food shortages were severe and persistent. The winter of 1946–47 would later be remembered as one of the hardest in modern German history. For former POWs, the contrast was unbearable. Some spoke little of captivity, others spoke only of it. The memory of American camps of regular meals, clean beds, medical care stood in quiet opposition to the suffering they now witnessed at home. It complicated narratives of victimhood and blame. It forced comparisons few were prepared to make. In interviews conducted years later, former prisoners returned again and again to food. Not as comfort, but as revelation. They described the shock of learning that war was not only about who fought harder, but who could sustain life while doing so. Many admitted that captivity had changed how they saw authority. They had obeyed orders, accepted sacrifice, trusted leadership that promised endurance would be rewarded. The mess halls of America had undermined that promise without a single argument. Historians would later note this effect. POW experiences in the United States contributed to post-war shifts in German attitudes toward democracy, governance, and international cooperation. Exposure to a functioning, abundant society, even in captivity, challenged assumptions drilled in over years of propaganda. This was not immediate transformation. There was no gratitude en masse, no sudden affection for former enemies. But seeds were planted. Food, again, was central. It had revealed capacity, it had exposed limits, it had made abstract concepts, industrial power, logistics, sustainability intimate and undeniable. By the time memories of the camps faded into stories told to children and grandchildren, one detail almost always remained intact: the laughter. Not because it was funny, but because it marked the moment when illusion finally collapsed, replaced by something far more difficult to accept: the quiet certainty that the war had been decided long before surrender, in places far from the battlefield. The meaning of that certainty would continue to echo, not just in memory, but in how modern warfare would be understood forever. In the end, no weapon explains the war as clearly as a meal. For the German prisoners who laughed in American mess halls, food became the final, irrefutable evidence of a truth the battlefield had obscured. Wars are not only won by courage or sacrifice. They are won by systems that can endure their own weight. The United States did not defeat Germany with bread alone. But bread revealed something bombs could not: the ability to sustain life while waging destruction. It exposed the difference between a society stretched to its limits and one operating within them. The laughter of the prisoners was not mockery, it was recognition. Recognition that hunger had been reframed as virtue, that endurance had been demanded without the means to support it, and that faith had been placed in promises that arithmetic could not justify. In captivity, stripped of ideology and urgency, reality arrived quietly. 3 meals a day, every day. No speeches, no slogans. Just continuity. This experience did not erase guilt or suffering. It did not absolve responsibility, but it reshaped understanding. It showed that modern war is decided long before the first shot, in fields and factories, in rail schedules and harvest yields. For history, that lesson endures. The war ended with surrender documents and ruined cities. But its meaning lingers in smaller moments, like a room full of exhausted men laughing through tears, realizing too late that the outcome had been written not in blood but in abundance. And in that quiet recognition, the 20th century learned a truth it would never forget.